The mirror arrived just before dawn, wrapped in rotting burlap and black rope. Elias heard scratching inside the wooden crate before touching the rusted nails. When the lid finally cracked open, freezing air spilled across his apartment floor like breath from a tomb. Dust coated the enormous Victorian frame like grey funeral ash left behind after a fire. Thin silver carvings twisted around the edges like screaming human faces trapped beneath metal. A long crack divided the mirror from top to bottom like a wound. Elias bought strange antiques for collectors, forgotten museums, and desperate wealthy clients. Money had nearly vanished after the university destroyed his reputation over controversial historical theories. The mirror felt valuable enough to rescue his collapsing career and miserable future. The antique shop owner refused to help carry the mirror outside after accepting the payment. His trembling hands avoided the glass whenever candlelight reflected across its fractured surface. Before Elias left, the old man quietly warned him never to stare into it after midnight. Rain hammered the city while Elias dragged the mirror into his apartment building alone. Every hallway bulb flickered violently as the frame passed beneath the weak yellow lighting. Neighbors peeked through cracked doors before quickly locking themselves safely inside again. He leaned the mirror against the living room wall beside dusty shelves packed with books. The reflection showed his apartment exactly, except darker wallpaper covered the reflected walls behind him. Elias turned immediately, yet the real wall remained pale, cracked, and stained with age. A cold sensation crawled slowly across his neck while he studied the strange difference carefully. Inside the reflection, a wooden door slowly appeared near the kitchen entrance without explanation. The door certainly did not exist anywhere inside his real apartment. Elias stepped backward suddenly, accidentally knocking research papers across the wooden floorboards beside him. When he looked again, the mysterious reflected doorway had vanished completely from the cracked glass. Only his exhausted reflection stared silently back at him beneath the apartment lights. Night settled heavily across the building like suffocating black water, swallowing every nearby sound completely. Elias poured whiskey and searched online records connected to the mirror's previous ownership history. Most references ended abruptly with missing police reports, suicides, or unexplained disappearances. Near midnight, faint whispering drifted through the apartment from no visible source around him. Elias followed the sound toward the mirror with growing unease twisting painfully inside his chest. The glass reflected candlelight despite every lamp inside the room remaining brightly illuminated. A pale woman suddenly appeared inside the reflection directly behind Elias for several terrifying seconds. She wore a black Victorian morning dress stained darkly around the lace collar and sleeves. Her hollow eyes remained fixed upon him without blinking even once. Elias spun around violently, but the apartment behind him stood completely empty and silent afterward. When he faced the mirror again, the woman had already disappeared into the fractured darkness. Deep within the cracked glass, somebody softly knocked 3 slow times. The knocking returned the following night, while rain drowned the city streets beyond the apartment windows. Elias froze beside his desk as the sound echoed once again from inside the mirror. 3 slow knocks pressed through the room like fists striking a coffin lid underground. He approached carefully, gripping a fireplace poker with trembling hands and shallow nervous breathing afterward. The reflection showed his living room exactly as before, except the wallpaper looked darker again. Near the kitchen, the mysterious reflected doorway had returned silently during the night. Unlike before, the door inside the reflection now stood slightly open beneath flickering candlelight somewhere beyond it. Thin golden light leaked through the narrow crack beneath the reflected doorway like liquid fire. Elias stared silently while cold breath fogged the mirror's fractured silver surface. The whispers started moments later, low and overlapping like distant funeral prayers spoken underground together. He could not understand the words, yet they sounded painfully desperate and deeply terrified somehow. Beneath the voices, somebody softly wept, somewhere beyond the reflected doorway, hidden inside darkness. Elias forced himself away and buried his attention inside old historical archives, scattered across his desk. Hours passed while he searched forgotten property records connected to the antique dealer's neighborhood district carefully. Every trail eventually led toward a burned Victorian mansion demolished decades earlier after mysterious disappearances. According to one newspaper article, the mansion belonged to the wealthy Ashcombe family generations earlier. Servants claimed strange noises echoed through sealed rooms every night before the terrible fire erupted. Surviving witnesses insisted certain mirrors inside the estate still reflected the missing house afterward. Elias printed every article and pinned them across his apartment walls before dawn finally arrived outside. The deeper he researched, the stronger his obsession became with the reflected Victorian room inside the mirror. He convinced himself the artifact might reveal something historically impossible and academically priceless. The next evening, exhaustion dragged heavily beneath his bloodshot eyes and pale expression afterward. He accidentally fell asleep while reviewing photographs beside the cracked Victorian mirror leaning against the wall. A sudden voice whispering his name awakened him instantly from terrifying dreams and darkness. Inside the reflection, the mysterious doorway now stood fully open for the first time since arriving. Beyond it stretched a candlelit Victorian room decorated with faded curtains, portraits, and rotting furniture. Shadows moved slowly across the walls, despite no visible person standing anywhere inside the room. Elias stepped closer until his breath touched the cold glass surface directly before his terrified face. The room inside smelled faintly of smoke, mildew, and something horribly rotten hidden beneath the floorboards. Then a gramophone somewhere inside the reflection suddenly began playing distorted music softly. A tall figure emerged slowly from the darkness beside the far corner of the reflected room nearby. Its body looked unnaturally thin beneath a black Victorian coat covered in dust and stains. Though its face remained hidden, Elias felt its attention settle directly upon him through the mirror. The figure lifted one pale hand and pointed silently toward the reflection's open doorway behind it slowly. Elias staggered backward in terror as the apartment lights exploded above his head, simultaneously without warning. In the sudden darkness, the mirror no longer reflected his living room at all. Darkness swallowed the apartment after the lights burst above Elias like distant gunfire during a storm. For several seconds, only the gramophone music drifted softly from the mirror across the ruined room afterward. The distorted melody sounded painfully slow, like the fading heartbeat of something ancient and dying. Elias fumbled desperately for his phone, while broken glass crackled beneath his shoes inside the darkness. The flashlight finally illuminated the apartment with weak, trembling white light from his shaking hands. Every object remained untouched except the mirror standing silently against the living room wall nearby. Its reflection had completely changed during the blackout moments earlier, that terrifying night inside the apartment. The Victorian room now appeared clearer than Elias's actual surroundings, beyond the cracked mirror surface itself. Candle flames flickered inside the glass, casting moving shadows across crimson wallpaper and dusty furniture. The tall figure still stood motionless beside the far corner near heavy velvet curtains hanging nearby. Its pale hand remained raised toward the open doorway deeper inside the reflected Victorian room silently. Elias noticed dark liquid dripping slowly from the figure's fingertips onto the wooden floorboards beneath it. He tried pulling his attention away, yet the mirror held him like a living trap somehow afterward. The reflected room looked impossibly real compared to his cold apartment surrounding him in darkness and silence. Even candle smoke drifted naturally upward against the fractured silver surface before his horrified face. Then Elias noticed movement behind the partially open doorway, hidden deeper inside the reflection itself afterward. Something crawled briefly across the floor before vanishing back into darkness beyond the room immediately. The shape moved with the unnatural speed of a starving animal hunting unseen prey nearby. A child's laughter echoed softly from somewhere beyond the reflected room only moments later afterward. Elias felt his stomach tighten as the sound slowly transformed into violent sobbing and desperate crying. The gramophone music stopped immediately afterward, without warning, leaving unbearable silence surrounding the apartment completely. Silence settled across the room heavier than anything Elias had ever experienced previously during his life. Even the rain outside seemed muted beneath the crushing stillness surrounding the mirror and reflected room afterward. Then the tall figure finally began moving toward the glass, one slow step at a time. Its body twitched unnaturally beneath the long black Victorian coat while approaching him through candlelight, silently afterward. Candlelight revealed stretched skin across its neck, like wet paper pulled too tightly over bone underneath. Elias still could not see the figure's hidden face beneath the darkness covering it entirely. The mirror suddenly fogged over except for 3 words traced slowly from inside the cracked glass surface. Elias stared in disbelief at the message appearing before his horrified eyes through drifting candle smoke afterward. It simply read, "Don't open the door." Before he could react, somebody knocked violently from the other side of the reflected doorway hidden nearby. The sound exploded through the apartment with terrifying force like wood, splintering beneath heavy blows repeatedly. The tall figure instantly turned toward the doorway, as though frightened by whatever approached from darkness. The reflected door slowly creaked wider while darkness poured across the Victorian room floor beneath candlelight silently. Elias heard uneven footsteps approaching from somewhere hidden beyond the doorway's black interior hallway afterward. Then another reflection appeared beside him inside the mirror, even though nobody physically stood there. The second reflection stood beside Elias with unnatural stillness and impossible silence surrounding her completely afterward. Its outline appeared blurred at first, like smoke trapped behind dirty glass and candlelight together somehow. Then the figure sharpened slowly into the image of a pale Victorian woman wearing black mourning clothes. Her dress dragged across the reflected floor beneath unseen wind and moving shadows throughout the room silently. Deep stains darkened the lace collar wrapped tightly around her thin throat and shoulders beneath candlelight. Elias recognized her immediately as the woman from the first terrifying night beside the mirror earlier. She stared directly at him through the cracked mirror, without blinking once, or moving afterwards silently. There, her hollow eyes carried unbearable exhaustion, fear, and something even darker hidden beneath both emotions somehow. Then her lips parted slightly, as though struggling desperately to speak through the fractured glass. The gramophone suddenly screeched alive again beside the reflected doorway behind her, trembling body afterward violently. Distorted violin music flooded the apartment, while candle flames flickered wildly inside the reflected Victorian room nearby. Elias covered his ears, yet the sound pressed painfully deeper into his skull and thoughts. The woman finally raised one shaking finger toward the reflected room behind her, silently through the candlelight afterward. Elias followed the gesture and noticed photographs scattered across a dusty wooden table nearby inside the room. Every photograph showed different people standing before the exact same Victorian mirror throughout many decades. Some photographs looked ancient, while others appeared disturbingly recent and modern beneath layers of dust afterward. Several faces had been scratched away violently until only dark holes remained across the paper surfaces. Others displayed terrified expressions, frozen moments before something horrible reached them from behind the reflected doorway. Elias forced himself closer despite every instinct begging him to run immediately away from the apartment forever. One photograph showed the antique shop owner standing beside the mirror nearly 30 years earlier, silently there. Another showed a missing young woman Elias recognized from an online archive searched the previous night. Then Elias noticed something horrifying hidden within every photograph displayed before him beneath candlelight afterward. Somewhere inside each image, the reflected doorway always stood slightly open in the distant background silently. A tall shadow figure also appeared closer each time the photographs progressed chronologically throughout the decades afterward. The mourning woman suddenly pressed both hands flat against the inside surface of the cracked glass desperately afterward. Her terrified expression twisted as though hearing something approach from behind the reflected doorway once again nearby. Elias turned instinctively toward the dark opening deeper inside the Victorian room, hidden beyond candlelight. Heavy footsteps echoed slowly from the unseen hallway beyond the doorway's black interior, hidden inside darkness afterward. Each step sounded wet and uneven like soaked boots dragging through mud, water, and thick blood together. The tall shadow figure retreated backward into darkness, as though frightened by whatever approached from deeper within. A new figure emerged slowly from the hallway, bending unnaturally beneath the candlelit ceiling above it, afterward silently. Its limbs looked impossibly long beneath rotting Victorian clothing, stained black around the chest and sleeves heavily. Elias finally understood the smell surrounding the mirror was not mildew, smoke, or rotting wood at all. The creature lifted its head slowly toward the glass, while the mourning woman began screaming silently nearby afterward. Torn flesh stretched across its face like burned wax, hanging loosely from exposed bone underneath everything there. Then the mirror whispered directly into Elias's ear, with a voice identical to his own. "Open the door," the mirror whispered beside Elias with his exact voice, and breathing afterward quietly there. The sound crawled through his skull, like insects burrowing beneath flesh, bone, and frightened thoughts together painfully. Elias stumbled backward, knocking papers and photographs across the apartment floor violently behind him. The creature inside the reflection continued staring directly at him, without blinking or breathing visibly afterward. There, candlelight revealed jagged teeth beneath strips of hanging skin around its twisted mouth and ruined face. Its impossibly long fingers scraped slowly against the reflected doorway behind the mourning woman beside the mirror. Elias grabbed a heavy chair and hurled it toward the mirror in blind terror and desperation afterward. The chair struck the glass with tremendous force before crashing uselessly onto the apartment floorboards nearby afterward. Not even the existing crack across the mirror widened after the violent impact against the cursed surface. The mourning woman suddenly turned toward Elias and mouthed words without producing any sound afterward there silently. Though silent, her expression carried unmistakable desperation and terror beneath every movement she desperately attempted afterward. Elias finally understood. She was begging him not to listen to the mirror's terrible whispers anymore. Then the apartment around him changed without warning during the following terrifying seconds afterward. Silently there completely, the air grew colder while distant candlelight flickered across walls behind Elias. Unexpectedly, inside the apartment itself, he turned slowly and discovered Victorian wallpaper spreading across his apartment like living infection beneath shadows. Dark red fabric crawled over peeling paint, while antique furniture replaced modern shelves and appliances nearby afterward. His ceiling transformed into stained wooden panels, dripping with black moisture from unseen cracks above him silently. The reflected room was bleeding directly into reality around him through the cursed mirror and darkness. Panic overtook Elias as he rushed toward the apartment entrance to escape the nightmare unfolding completely afterward. The hallway outside had vanished beyond the doorway, replaced by endless darkness and whispering voices surrounding him silently. Somewhere inside that darkness, unseen footsteps shuffled slowly closer toward the apartment and reflected room beyond. The gramophone music returned louder than before, shaking the room with distorted violin notes afterward violently nearby. Elias covered his ears while portraits appeared suddenly across transformed Victorian walls surrounding the apartment completely afterward. Every portrait displayed previous mirror owners with their eyes violently scratched away from the painted faces. One portrait stopped Elias cold when he noticed the face staring from its dusty frame carefully afterward. The painting showed Elias himself wearing Victorian clothing beside the cracked mirror inside the reflected room silently. Fresh paint still glistened wetly across his terrified expression and hollow eyes beneath candlelight nearby. The mourning woman reached outward from inside the mirror until her fingers pierced through the glass surface afterward. Elias watched in horror as the mirror rippled like black water around her pale, trembling hand nearby. She grabbed his wrist tightly before the creature could reach him from the reflected doorway first. Ice-cold pain shot through Elias's body the instant their skin touched beneath candlelight. And drifting shadows afterward, memories flooded violently into his mind from countless strangers who once owned the cursed Victorian mirror. He witnessed disappearances, madness, suicides, and bodies discovered locked inside completely empty rooms afterward, silently. Then the creature lunged suddenly from the reflected doorway with horrifying speed and unnatural hunger afterward nearby. The mourning woman screamed silently while the mirror surface wrapped around Elias like freezing liquid darkness afterward. In one terrifying instant, the apartment vanished completely as something dragged him through the fractured glass. Elias awoke, choking on dust and candle smoke inside freezing darkness and terrible silence surrounding everything afterward. Splintered wooden floorboards pressed painfully beneath his trembling hands and bruised knees inside the reflected room silently. Somewhere nearby, water dripped steadily like blood falling into a deep unseen well beneath the house. Rows of candles flickered around him inside the Victorian room from the mirror reflection afterward silently nearby. Their weak flames revealed torn wallpaper hanging from mold-covered walls, stained nearly black with age and moisture. The air smelled of rot, smoke, and something dead hidden beneath the ancient floorboards surrounding him. For several moments, Elias remained completely still while distant footsteps echoed beyond the nearby doorway afterward silently. The sound moved slowly through unseen hallways deeper inside the impossible Victorian house, surrounding the reflected room completely. Each step carried the same wet, dragging noise he heard before entering the cursed mirror earlier. He forced himself upright and staggered toward the cracked mirror, standing against the opposite wall nearby afterward. Inside the glass, his modern apartment appeared perfectly normal again, beneath warm electric lighting and steady rain. Rain still hammered softly against the windows beyond his empty living room and scattered research papers. Relief flooded through Elias until movement inside the reflection caught his terrified attention suddenly afterward there. His apartment door slowly opened, even though nobody should have possessed a key that night anymore. A young woman stepped carefully inside, carrying a flashlight and dripping umbrella, while looking nervously around afterward. Elias slammed both fists desperately against the mirror, while screaming for her to leave immediately afterward. No sound escaped the glass, despite the pain tearing through his throat and lungs violently during panic. The woman continued searching the apartment without hearing him or seeing the reflected Victorian room nearby afterward. Behind Elias, the gramophone began playing its distorted melody once more. Inside the Victorian room, afterward softly, he turned slowly and discovered dozens of shadow figures standing silently throughout the candlelit darkness nearby afterward. Their hollow eyes reflected candle flames, while rotting Victorian clothing hung from skeletal bodies around the room. Among the figures stood the mourning woman who pulled Elias through the mirror earlier that terrible night. Tears of black liquid streamed down her pale face as she watched him silently trembling nearby afterward. Elias finally understood she had never been trying to trap him inside the reflected room forever. Instead, she had been trying desperately to warn him before the creature escaped into reality completely afterward. The trapped spirits around him were not servants of the mirror or the reflected Victorian house afterward. They were prisoners sacrificed long ago to keep something ancient locked behind the reflected doorway forever. The shadow figures slowly raised trembling hands toward the reflected apartment visible behind Elias afterward silently there. Their mouths opened unnaturally wide, while low whispers filled the room from every darkened corner nearby afterward. Together, the voices repeated one horrifying sentence over and over, without stopping throughout the room. She opened the door. The young woman inside Elias's apartment approached the mirror cautiously with growing curiosity and visible unease afterward there. Her flashlight beam crossed the cracked Victorian glass before settling directly upon Elias's trapped reflection nearby afterward. For one brief second, their eyes met through both worlds, simultaneously beneath flickering apartment lights. Then the mirror changed her reflection behind the fractured silver surface. Slowly and deliberately afterward, there silently, instead of Elias's apartment, she now saw the candlelit Victorian room, stretching endlessly beyond the glass itself. Deep within the darkness behind her reflected image, Elias watched the creature begin smiling once again. The reflected doorway behind the creature creaked wider than ever before, inside the endless Victorian darkness afterward. Thick darkness spilled outward like black water flooding ancient wooden floorboards throughout the reflected room nearby silently. Candle flames dimmed one by one, as unseen whispers filled every corner of the impossible house afterward. Elias backed away from the mirror, while the trapped spirits around him began trembling violently with fear afterward. Some covered their faces, while others dropped silently to their knees beneath the candlelit darkness surrounding everything. Even the mourning woman stepped backward from the doorway with terror filling her hollow, exhausted eyes afterward. The creature slowly emerged farther from the darkness behind the reflected hallway hidden inside the mirror afterward. Its limbs cracked loudly with every movement, like dry branches snapping inside frozen woods during winter nights. Long fingers dragged across the floorboards, leaving wet black streaks behind its crawling body, afterward silently there. Inside the apartment reflection, the young woman lifted her trembling hand toward the mirror surface carefully afterward. Nearby, Elias screamed soundlessly for her to run before touching the cracked Victorian glass hanging before her there. The creature immediately turned its ruined face toward her movement from inside the reflected darkness afterward. For one horrible moment, the woman's fingertips brushed the mirror surface gently beneath flickering apartment lights afterward. Ripples spread outward through the glass, exactly like disturbed water beneath moonlight across a dark lake silently. The apartment lights flickered violently while the gramophone music rose into a deafening shriek around both worlds. The mourning woman grabbed Elias suddenly and pulled him toward another mirror hidden beneath torn cloth nearby afterward. Unlike the cursed mirror, this smaller glass reflected nothing except endless darkness, staring back silently afterward there. Elias understood instantly that trapped spirits were searching desperately for a way to imprison the creature once again. The young woman in the apartment stumbled backward as blood suddenly appeared across the mirror. Crack afterward there. A long hand pressed slowly outward from the Victorian glass, toward her terrified face through rippling darkness silently. She screamed and dropped the flashlight onto the apartment floor beside the shattered research papers afterward. Elias rushed toward the smaller hidden mirror, while the mourning woman held back trembling spirits nearby afterward. The creature's laughter echoed through both worlds, simultaneously like rusted blades scraping against human bone repeatedly afterward. Candle flames exploded throughout the room as the reflected doorway finally swung completely open into darkness. Endless shadows moved inside that doorway with the shape of countless twisting bodies trapped within afterward. There, Elias saw faces forming briefly inside the blackness before sinking back beneath its surface once more, silently. Every face belonged to someone who once stared too long into the cursed mirror during their lives. The young woman tried running from the apartment, but the front door slammed shut violently before her afterward. Cracks spread across the apartment walls, while Victorian wallpaper slowly bled through modern paint around the room. The curse had already begun infecting the real world again through the mirror and reflected house. With trembling hands, Elias lifted the smaller mirror toward the creature emerging from the reflected doorway afterward. The dark glass reflected the monster instantly, despite showing nothing else around the Victorian room nearby afterward. For the first time, fear crossed the creature's ruined face beneath the candlelit darkness, surrounding everything silently. The mourning woman screamed silently and lunged toward the creature alongside the trapped spirits surrounding the room afterward. Skeletal hands seized its limbs, while shadow figures dragged it backward toward the reflected doorway once more. The creature shrieked with impossible rage as darkness swallowed the Victorian room violently around Elias afterward. Elias thrust the smaller mirror directly against the cracked Victorian glass standing before him. Afterwards, silently there, both mirrors shattered simultaneously with a deafening sound like collapsing cathedral bells echoing through endless darkness afterward. Candlelight vanished instantly as every trapped spirit dissolved into blackness around the reflected Victorian room afterward. The final thing Elias saw was the mourning woman smiling sadly before disappearing forever into darkness afterwards silently. Then cold silence swallowed everything completely. Morning sunlight eventually crept across the floor of Elias's ruined apartment building quietly. After the terrible night, police officers discovered broken furniture, scattered photographs, and shattered glass covering every wall and surface afterward. Yet no sign of Elias himself was ever found anywhere inside the destroyed apartment afterward. Only one object remained untouched among the destruction left behind that terrible morning afterward. Silently there, resting upright against the apartment wall, stood a small antique mirror with a thin silver frame. Deep within its dark reflection, a shadowy figure could still be seen knocking softly from the other side.